All right, what's up, my mathletes? That's right, Mr. Muscarella coming at you. Before we get going with today's video on Rene Descartes' rational zero theorem, why don't you give yourself a moment, give yourself a high five, pat yourself on the back, because you're awesome. If nobody's told you that today, let me be the first one to remind you that you are pretty awesome. All right, so with that said, let's go ahead and take a look at Rene Descartes and his rational zero theorem. So he's a French philosopher, mathematician, and he was the person responsible for coming up with ways to figure out roots to real number roots for polynomial functions. He did that two ways. One's rational zero theorem, the other is his rule of signs. All right, so when we look at the rational zero theorem, so his theorem, it kind of breaks things down into two parts with that. So we got to come up with this ratio of P over Q, where P is going to be the factors of the constant. So we've got to identify where the constants are, and then the Q, that's going to be the factors of the leading coefficient. So those are going to be the two things, and it's very common for people to get those parts mixed up. So what I'd like to do to prevent myself from getting these wrapped up is just kind of write that down. Now, when I take a look at number one and number two, so we'll go through those together. I'm going to use a highlighter, use whatever's going to help you stay organized. But when I look at Q, that leading coefficient, so right here for number one, x cubed, that would be that spot right there. And then my leading coefficient is going to be a 2 over here in this term for number 2. My constant term, now both of these do have constants, and in number one, my constant is 15, and my constant in number 2 is -6. So I got to get those two things identified first. So then after I do that, so let's go ahead and take a look at number one. Then we'll do two together, and I'm going to have you do 3 and 4 to try those on your own. So I like to actually write down the values for P and Q. P and Q, so the factors of 15, and each one of your factors will always have a plus or minus in front of it. So plus or minus. Now to get 15, I could do plus or minus 1. I'm going to go all the way out here to the end and do plus or minus 15. So 1 and 15 can give you a product of 15, or -1 and -15. So that's why we put the plus and the minus with that. Now, two other numbers that can give you a product of 15 are 3 and 5, or -3, -5. So you would write down plus or minus 3 and then plus or minus 5. So those are the 4 digits that would go in that top row. Now to get 1, so I'm looking at my Q value now. So my Q value is going to be, that's 1, and the only two possible factors of 1 are 1 times 1 or -1 times -1. So that's why we're going to put plus or minus 1. Now what we do to figure out the possible zeros, because that's all this says is like, hey, what are all the possible rational zeros? So we're going to list those possibilities based on the ratio that we get from looking at P over Q. Now in this case, when we do that, all of these, so if I look at P over Q for this first term, I have 1 over 1. All right, so if I have 1 over 1, so that would just give me 1. So I'd have plus or minus 1. That's one possibility. Now if I take a look at this version right here, I'm going to have 3 over 1. So with that, I would have plus or minus and then 3 over 1. But you don't write it like that. We just write plain old 3. So plus or minus 3. And if I did the same thing with my next term, so I'd have 5 over 1. So that would end up giving me plus or minus 5. Then my last term would be plus or minus 15. So these would be all of my possible zeros for this. Now you can notate it like this with the braces around it, or other times you might just write the words possible zeros and then generate that list. Now it's important when you generate that list to make sure you have the plus or minus by each term. All right, that's it. That's all you got to do. So the biggest challenge is getting the P and the Q right and reducing your fractions. Now, let's take a look at number 2 over here, right? So in number 2, so we take a look at P over Q on this one. P over Q, so again, we're going to write P equals, now our P value is -6, and our Q value, so that's the leading coefficient, which in this case is 2. So we're going to have those two values in our little table. Now to get -6, we can have two numbers, so plus or minus 1 and then plus or minus 6. So those are two possibilities, because if I could do 1 times -6 or -1 times +6. So that's why each one of them has a plus or a minus with them. Now to get 6, I could also use 2 and 3. So plus or minus 2 and plus or minus 3. So those are my 4 distinct values that I'll put up in that first row. Now for Q, I got a couple options here. So I can do plus or minus 1 times plus or minus 2. Because again, you could have 1 times 2 to get 2. So that's one option where both of those are positive. Or you can do negative 1 times negative 2. So depending on those, so we're always going to list pluses and minuses when we do that. Now, we're going to take a look at everything here in this numerator, or in the top, like in the P row, we're going to divide everything there by 1. So if I were to take 1 divided by 1, well, we just know that that's 1. So that's one option. So we would have 1 with a plus or minus with it. And then if we do the next term, so 2 divided by 1, so that would give me just plain old 2. So plus or minus 2, and I think you guys can probably get the hang of that. The next one would be plus or minus 3, and then plus or minus 6. So all of those come from dividing everything in the P level, on that level, divided by 1. Now, I'm going to go next over here to the 2. So I'm going to take each one of those. I'm going to do the same thing, kind of divide everything by 2 this time. So on this first one, I'd have 1 and 2. So 1 would be in the top and 2 would be in the bottom. So that would give me a fraction plus or minus 1 over 2. Now in my next one, when we go to take a look at this next one, I would have 2 over 2. Well, if we reduce that, so when you think about that, so 2 over 2, that would just reduce down to 1. Well, if you look at it, and again, we'd have a plus or minus with it. If you look at that, we've already got that over there. So we don't have to write that again. So we're good. So you don't have to work with that term, but then we do have to take a look at our next term. So here, now we have the 3's and the 2's, all right? So we would have, for that term, we would end up with plus or minus 3 over 2. And then my last term, so here we would look at the 6 in the numerator, so that'd be the p-value I'd use, and the 2 in the denominator, but 6 over 2, so that's going to be similar to this other one. If we did 6 over 2, that would just give us 3. And again, with a plus or minus in front of that, but that term is already listed, so you do not have to list it twice. You only list each term once. So no repeating and everything. So our answer for this would just be this whole thing right here. And then we put a little braces around it. And then don't forget, erase the comma for that last one. All right, so that's how you would go ahead and notate that. So that's the list of possible zeros right there for those two pieces. All right, so I'm going to give you a moment or so. Go ahead and try numbers 3 and 4 on your own. And then come on back in a moment, and let's check it out and see how you did. All right, so how did we do on those two? Hopefully, you did all right with them, and you've got all of the factors listed there. Now, question is going to come up. Do they have to be in this order? And the answer is no, they do not. All right, as long as you have all of the factors that are there, as long as you have all of the possible zeros, you're good. All right, so the order does not matter as long as you have all of them correctamundo. All right, so take your time with that. I'm sure, it just takes a little bit of practice to get those down. The main thing you got to watch for is get those P's and Q's in the right spot. And the rest of that, you'll be good to go, my friends. So that's right. Give yourself a pat on the back, and I'll catch up with you guys later, my friends. Make it a great day as always, and I'll catch up with you soon. Peace out.